This is a coil spring. It is commonly found in automobiles and other heavy machinery applications. Now, as a swordsmith, I've made some pretty cool swords, but I typically don't use scrap steel like this, and thus the question remains, can we make a sword from it or not? Now, the first big challenge of this project is that I can't simply just take the spring and flatten it out. I decided to go with a Celtic short sword for my design, and so the spring by itself won't give me the width that I need for my blade. Now that's where a historical technique comes into play. You see, thousands of years ago, whenever the Iron Age first came to be, swords were made of just that, iron. Now iron by itself is not very good for swords, as it tends to be soft and you almost need to work harden it to get it to any sort of functional quality. Fast forward some time, those ancient craftsmen found out that if you add carbon to iron, you get steel, which is a much better material for swords. Now it's during this transitionary time where we first see swordsmiths taking steel and wrapping it around iron cores. Well, thousands of years later, we're going to use the same technique to solve our problem. Now the first step is we need to straighten out our coil spring. This will be the steel for our sword. So what I'm going to do is heat up the forge before going to the edge of the anvil and just gently starting to pull this apart. Now that we've straightened out our coil spring, we're going to set that aside so we can begin to work on our iron core. For our iron, I'm going to be using a piece of wagon wheel, which is known to be wrought iron. This is a really cool material and has a lot of impurities in it, so whenever you etch it, you have this really cool pattern, which we'll see later. But for now though, I need to forge it down into a manageable shape.
One of the biggest issues I'm facing right off the bat with this billet is how tall it is. It wants to crinkle down on itself. So I basically just need to take my time taking small bites. That way I keep everything nice and true. Let's do it. Alright, so now our wrought iron core has been completely profiled. It's ready for the next step. Now real quick, it's really interesting because you can kind of see almost a wood grain texture in this metal, and I cannot wait to etch that later and see what it looks like. For now though, we're going to turn the forge back on and begin to wrap the edge steel all the way around the iron.
And man, this is the scariest part.
Okay, what could possibly go wrong? No, come on now, don't do that to me. Come on now.
Now that our parts are forged for the final billet, what we're going to do is clean off all the surfaces, and then we're going to weld them together. Now I had to actually use the press to pinch everything down here, and then I just add a couple tack welds to hold things together before we forge weld it. The reason this weld is so scary is because as I forge down on the sides, the tip of the weld is going to want to pop apart on me. So I have to take my time here and make sure that I do this right so that I don't end up with a crappy sword billet.
Okay, so it seems like it welded, but there's a spot at the tip where there's a huge gap. So I can't move on with that in there, so I need to now cut it out in a V shape to do our fish mouth weld. That'll close things up and keep the steel along the cutting edge. So let's do that.
Now, when it comes to actually grinding the sword, because of the way that I forged this, I'm basically going to flatten everything off. From there, then I can add in our distal taper, which means that it's going to be thicker towards the hilt and skinnier towards the tip. This will help properly distribute the mass across the entire blade and make things more balanced. All right, so I just got done cleaning off a little bit of this tip here, and I decided to dip it in some ferric, and oh my goodness, this is wild. All right, so the blade has been quenched and is now hard. So what we're gonna do is let it cool down before we go into the temper, and then I can finish grinding the bevels. So now as we start to grind the sword, I basically need to make sure I keep things cool so I don't ruin the temper on it. So to do that, I need to fill my bucket back up with some water. Now that our sword has been ground and is roughly polished, we can move on to final polishing. Now, I want to stop here because I get a lot of questions about my respirator, as respirators are a really crucial part of the job. To give you an idea of how much dust we created, the sword started out a little over 1,000 grams of metal, and by the time that I was done, it was down to 380 grams. That's a lot of loss, and all of that dust would have went into the air. So if I didn't have a respirator, it'd be really dangerous to breathe in. Now, the respirator that I use, though, is by a company called Forged Air. This is a small Canadian-based company, and they produce these really cool respirators. The reason I like them, though, is because they're reusable and they're comfortable to wear, which is something that's hard to find with an affordable respirator.
This really is my secret weapon to grinding anything of any size, because this thing is so comfortable, you can talk through it without any issues, and you can breathe through it like nobody's business.
Another added benefit is that if you don't like wearing safety glasses, they actually come with these visors that you can pop in and out. I really like this feature because I always have a problem with my safety glasses fogging up during grinding, but with a visor I don't have the same issue. To make things even better, I actually recently reached out to see if I could get you guys a discount code, and I did. And so you can use this code to get 10% off your order if you want to buy one.
Boing.
Now the last thing we need to do before this becomes a deadly sword is to make the handle. Now to do this, I'm first going to trace it out on a piece of paper before I reference a couple of drawings that I have from historical text. I'm designing this based around the style of handle called an anthropomorphic handle. This means that it's modeled around a human shape. Historically, some of these handles actually feature a little human head as a pommel. While I'm not going to be doing a human head on this sword, I am going to be basing it on a design that's from a sword from the 3rd century BC. Now you might be wondering how we're going to sculpt such a handle, and to do this I'm going to employ the use of lost wax casting. This is a technique that's been around for thousands of years, and essentially what we're going to do is carve the pieces out of wax so then we can make them into metal later. So now I have to find a little piece of wax that basically fits the mold. So what I'm thinking is I have these leftover pieces of green wax from a previous sword project, and I'm thinking that if I cut these and cut them on an angle, I can rejoin them to get the sort of shape that we need. So this is what I'm thinking I'm going to go with. So let's see what we can do with that. And then just press them together. Just like that. Now this next step is actually really cool because what I'm going to do is use the Dragon's Breath of the Forge to basically just warm up the tang, and then I'm going to press that through the hole that I just drilled in the wax. What this will do is it'll burn through it and leave me with a perfectly fitting slot for our tang. That way we don't have to fit this up by hand later. The next step is to make up this middle piece, and so for this, I'm going to use a piece of wenge, which is a really exotic wood, but I'm basically just going to drill some holes through and make a slot that I then can shape. Later, I'll be employing the use of a weathering technique to this wood to hopefully make it look aged, and wenge is a perfect one to do that with as it has large fibrous grain. Now that all our wax elements are carved for the handle, what I'm going to do is called spruing, which is essentially just creating a pathway to go to each part of a wax model. It's really important to understand how metal flows when it's molten like this, as that's going to determine where you put your sprue. If you don't have sprues in the right area, you could end up with major shrinkage in your part, or simply metal not getting where it needs to go. Easy does it. This next step, we're going to invest the parts in a plaster before putting them in a kiln to burn out the excess wax. This will leave a perfectly shaped cavity that we can pour in our molten metal for our final part.
All right, it should feel like pancake batter. Kind of like that. All right, so now let's vacuum it.
Hey, that works. Okay, then yeah, now we just need to put these shims in here.
Oh, oh, that feels good. Praise the Lord. That's awesome. Holy cow.
All right, so we're gonna throw the parts into here to basically give them a nice weathering. This is just a rock tumbler, but this thing is crazy loud. And so I'm gonna turn it on and then walk out of the workshop for a little bit and just hope that it's not too loud for the neighbors. Okay, so now this has been completely roughly shaped. Now I want to go one step farther and employ a certain weathering technique to make the wood look like it has been on the sword for a long time. So to do this, I'm basically going to take a steel brush and just hit the somewhat polished wenge, and that'll basically scrub out the softer parts of the wood and the grain and leave me with a really fibrous and almost abraded look to the wood. The wood looks like it's ancient. That is awesome. All right, oh my goodness, that's so cool. Now that all the parts are made for our sword, the last step is final assembly, and then we can do some cutting tests with them.
It's done! Yes! Oh, great Scott! It's time to chop some watermelon! Ah!